All right, let's dive right into this. It's honestly one of the most striking paradoxes in all of modern military history. How exactly does a commander fighting for a brutal, authoritarian regime end up earning the profound respect of his fiercest enemies? Well, welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking the life, the tactics, and the incredibly complex legacy of Erwin Rommel, a man widely known as the Desert Fox. He outwitted entire armies and became an absolute legend of maneuver warfare. But as you'll see, his story is as complicated as it is fascinating.
Just to give you an idea of how unique his position was, take a look at British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Right in the middle of World War II, addressing Parliament, Churchill openly acknowledged Rommel as a formidable and skillful opponent. I mean, think about that for a second. It was highly unusual for an Allied leader to stand up and publicly praise a German general during a total war. It really speaks volumes about the sheer impact Rommel had on the battlefield, not to mention the psychological hold he had over his adversaries. So, how did he get there?
Let's start with Section 1, the making of a commander.
To really understand the Desert Fox, we've got to rewind to the beginning. Unlike a lot of those monocle-wearing Prussian generals of his day, Rommel didn't come from some elite aristocratic military family. He had to rely entirely on his own merit and sheer initiative. Back in World War I, he proved to be an absolute master of mountain warfare. His crazy, aggressive tactics at the 1917 Battle of Caporetto actually earned him the Pour le Mérite. And he didn't just rest on his laurels after the war either. He literally wrote the book on infantry tactics, a super widely read manual that positioned him perfectly to command the 7th Panzer Division by the time the invasion of France kicked off in 1939.
And during that invasion, his relentless, rapid pacing earned his division a pretty spectacular nickname, the Ghost Division. Rommel led right from the front, completely throwing traditional, cautious pacing out the window. Actually, he would frequently cut his own communications just to avoid getting halt orders from high command. Because of this extreme mobility and the whole radio silence thing, his exact location was often a mystery, not just to the stunned Allied forces, but half the time to his own superiors back at German headquarters. He firmly established himself as one of the most talented and thoroughly unpredictable commanders out there.
Which brings us to Section 2, Mastering the Desert War.
So it's 1941, and he's dispatched to North Africa to bail out some severely struggling Italian forces. But Rommel wasn't just fighting the British here, he was fighting the ruthless logistics of the desert itself. Motorized war in this environment was an absolute nightmare. We're talking blistering heat during the day, freezing temperatures at night, vehicle engines completely choked by blinding sandstorms, and supply lines stretched to the absolute breaking point across barren terrain. Commanding an army to victory in these conditions meant he had to completely reimagine mechanized tactics and figure out an incredibly resilient logistical strategy.
But here's the thing, this is exactly where he thrived. This is where he earned the moniker, the Desert Fox. To make up for severely limited resources, Rommel brilliantly used the flat desert terrain, almost like a naval commander maneuvering fleets on the open ocean. Since he didn't have enough tanks, he aggressively repurposed 88mm anti-aircraft guns into devastating anti-tank weapons. He moved his heavily outnumbered armored forces using massive deception and complete surprise, consistently launching attacks way before the Allies ever saw them coming. He just outthought and outmaneuvered his opponents time and time again.
Moving into Section 3, the turning point.
Look, no winning streak lasts forever, right? Especially in a war of attrition. The momentum dramatically shifted when Rommel finally came face-to-face with his most formidable opponent, British General Bernard Montgomery. It was a fundamental clash of different styles. Rommel relied almost entirely on speed, surprise, and constant maneuvering. Montgomery, on the other hand, brought overwhelming logistical superiority to the table. While Rommel was quite literally operating on fumes, dealing with critical fuel and ammo shortages from punishing Allied attacks across the Mediterranean, Montgomery had this massive, steady stream of reinforcements and heavy armor. And as any commander will tell you, a brilliantly positioned tank with no gas is basically just a stationary target.
That harsh logistical reality came crashing down in 1942 at the Second Battle of Alamein. This monumental clash is widely regarded as the definitive turning point in the North African campaign. Despite Rommel's absolute best efforts and his incredibly complex battlefield maneuvers, logistics finally just overpowered tactical brilliance. The sheer overwhelming weight of British armor, artillery, and air superiority broke right through the lines, and Rommel was forced into a massive retreat. The days of the Desert Fox dictating the terms of the war in Africa were officially over.
Let's look at Section 4, the plot against Hitler. Fast forward to 1944, And Germany's military situation across all fronts is completely desperate. The Allies had landed in Normandy, the Soviets were pushing relentlessly from the east, and some high-ranking German officers concluded that Adolf Hitler had to be removed to save the country from total annihilation. After the failed assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20th, Rommel was accused of having deep ties to the resistance network. Now, historians are actually pretty divided here. The general consensus is that Rommel absolutely favored negotiating an end to the war to spare further bloodshed, but there's no concrete documentary evidence that he supported the actual assassination plot. Regardless of the exact truth, the severe paranoia gripping the regime meant Hitler completely lost trust in his most famous general.
Finally, Section 5, a complex legacy.
We've arrived at the final, darkest chapter. Picture this. It's October 14, 1944. Rommel is at his home in Germany, recovering from severe head injuries after an Allied aircraft strafed his staff car in France. Suddenly, 2 German generals arrive at his doorstep. But they aren't there for a friendly visit. They're operating under direct orders from the highest levels of the Nazi regime, and they brought with them a dire, inescapable ultimatum.
They presented him with a stark, totally impossible choice. Option 1, stand trial for high treason in a kangaroo court. That would guarantee his execution, and more importantly, it meant his family and loyal staff would suffer brutal reprisals. Or, Option 2, take a provided poison. In exchange, the regime promised he'd get a hero's state funeral, his public reputation would stay intact for the German people, and crucially, his wife and son would be completely spared from harm.
Faced with this horrific reality, Rommel chose the second option to protect his family. He stepped into a car with the 2 generals, drove a short distance away, and committed suicide by biting down on a cyanide capsule. The Nazi propaganda machine immediately went into overdrive to cover up the truth. They falsely reported to the public that their beloved Desert Fox had succumbed to those head injuries from the earlier air attack. It actually wasn't until after World War II had completely ended that the grim, true circumstances of his death became widely known to the world.
Yet despite his tragic end and the brutal regime he fought for, his military brilliance remains undeniable. Today, military academies globally still heavily study Rommel's campaigns. They look to him for vital lessons in maneuver warfare, how to exhibit frontline leadership under extreme pressure, unparalleled tactical innovation, and how to maintain operational mobility even when your logistics and resources are severely restricted. His desert campaigns are still considered absolute masterclasses in mobile, mechanized warfare.
But all of this leaves us with a really profound dilemma to think about. How exactly does history separate a commander's tactical genius from the brutal regime they serve? Erwin Rommel fought with honor on the battlefield, sure, but his operational victories undeniably served to prolong the life of one of the most destructive governments in human history. The Desert Fox outwitted armies and commanded the rare respect of his enemies, but his legacy is going to forever remain one of the most complex and debated in all of military history. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I'll leave you to ponder that final thought.